Since joining a group online that supports people with late onset type 1 diabetes, I discovered that we all had a lot of stuff in common, but one thing stood out mostly to me. We were all misdiagnosed at the start and told that we all had type 2 diabetes. We've all decided to come together to help spread awareness that late onset type 1 diabetes is currently and still being misdiagnosed far too often. So we hope that this video will help spread the word. I was misdiagnosed.
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 My 1-year wedding anniversary out of the country, I almost went into DKA.
But then eventually I started getting answers.
13 years misdiagnosed.
Because I wasn't convinced that I was a type 2.
Having to take medication for the rest of my life was too much to bear.
I was determined not to leave his office until he agreed to test.
My blood sugars were ranging in the 600s. I should have been in the hospital, but my body kept
She
going.
looked at me and she said, "You're not a type 2." So she sent me
The
to
fact that I was type 1 diabetic.
My doctor failed to understand was that I actually had type 1 diabetes and not type 2.
There was nothing I could do to stop my sugar levels rising.
You're not a typical type 2, but you are a type 2.
A nurse sat me down and told me that I was type 2 diabetic and that I obviously had a sweet tooth. She told me within a few weeks if I changed my diet, we could improve things and there'd be no need to medicate.
On my 1-year wedding anniversary out of the country, I almost went into DKA. I was misdiagnosed type 2, came back to the States, very confused because I had no idea what diabetes was. My doctor sent me to my endocrinologist. She looked at me and she said, "You're not a type 2." So she sent me to get some testing done. And in June of this year, 2018, I was completely diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, or LADA, which I wasn't familiar with. So after a lot of research, I realized that I was gonna have to go on full-time insulin, which I did this year. And I am currently on full-time insulin and my Freestyle Libre, which I absolutely love. It is life-changing. That's my story.
7 years ago, I was misdiagnosed as a type 2 diabetic. For 6 months, I remained still feeling ill at the initial diagnosis. Researching, telling my doctor I think I might be LADA. She said I didn't fit the protocol because I was African American, I was overweight and over 40. And I kept pushing and pushing. And so finally I had to break up with my doctor and self-refer to an endo who did all the workup and within a week came back with that positive diagnosis. We then had our insulin corrected. My A1C went from 13.9 down to a 7.9. My blood sugars were ranging in the 600s. I should have been in the hospital, but my body kept going and moving. I now still kind of stay a little elevated, but I'm still able to manage that now. I now have a pump. And so my recommendation to anyone is when you don't feel well, keep pushing. Sometimes you have to move away from what you know is comfortable. If your doctor's not listening to you, listen to your body. Know that, yes, there is additional testing out there. Your insurance will cover that additional testing. And just because you don't fit the mold, know that as diabetics, yes, we are compartmentalized, but truly we're not. Each person has different diagnoses. Your path to where you are now is different. So I'm very happy now, 7 years later. I am LADA, I am almost 50 years old, and yes, I'm a diabetic.
I was misdiagnosed as a type 2 diabetic in 2012. I was 47 years old. I was prescribed metformin and a few other medications that didn't work for me, and within 6 months I was on insulin. After I was diagnosed, I did some reading and I joined a support group and that's where I learned about late onset type 1 diabetes, LADA. And it took me some struggles to get my doctor to test me. Initially he would say things like, you're not a typical type 2, but you are a type 2 because of my age. After I did more reading and more research, and I found out through my support group that I was very likely type 1, I went to my doctor with those tests written down that I would need, and I was determined not to leave his office until he agreed to test me, which he did. He sent me for those tests, and he was very surprised to find out that I was a type 1. I was not surprised at all. The only thing that did change then was that he sent me to an endocrinologist, which he hadn't before. I'm hoping that because there are so many of us out there that are misdiagnosed, that this information is helpful to someone to get the proper diagnosis.
In 2005, when I was pregnant with my first child, I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes. That went away after I'd had her, apparently, and in 2008, pregnant again and also diagnosed with gestational diabetes. My third pregnancy in 2012, diagnosed again with gestational diabetes, but it didn't go away after I'd had the baby, and I was then diagnosed as a type 2. Continued along with blood sugars not too bad for 5 years, being very careful about what I ate, but then there was nothing I could do to stop my sugar levels rising. They were consistently high for almost a year. I was on numerous type 2 medications. A friend of mine who's a GP eventually suggested that I needed antibody testing because I didn't fit the profile of a type 2, and all of the different drugs that I had tried, something should have made a difference. So I eventually was referred to an endocrinologist earlier this year and got my diagnosis of type 1 diabetes in July. So 13 years misdiagnosed. Thank you.
About 7 months ago, I started showing symptoms of diabetes. These included peeing a lot, drinking lots of water, and numbness and tingling in the feet. The reason I knew I probably have diabetes was because 2 years before that, my doctor had told me that I was pre-diabetic. She said lay off the carbs, no more white flour, white sugar, breads, pastas, etc. I tried that, but I did not really succeed. It was a very hard lifestyle change. 7 months ago, when I started showing the symptoms, I went to the doctor and she ran some blood tests. Sure enough, my A1C was at 11.6, and she said I have diabetes. Type 2 to be exact. She prescribed 4 different types of medications. I started taking metformin, about 2,000 milligrams every day. I got very sick when I started metformin. The side effects were horrible. I couldn't stand it, and just the thought of having to take medication for the rest of my life was too much to bear. I decided to do some research. I started looking into how to reverse my diabetes through diet. I was very, very determined to make this thing stop. I started a plant-based diet, eating lots of nutrient-dense fruits and vegetables. However, although this was a good decision, what my doctor failed to understand was that I actually had type 1 diabetes and not type 2. Luckily, about a week later, we ran some additional tests which confirmed that I was type 1 diabetic. The difference between type 1 and type 2 is pretty simple. Type 2 can be reversed with lifestyle changes, with a good diet, cutting out the carbs, laying off the sugar. Type 1, however, is an autoimmune disease, and I'm happy to be part of this video, which is spreading awareness for type 1 diabetes. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anna and I live in Belgium. I've been diagnosed with gestational diabetes 10 years ago and have been told for the last 10 years that I was a type 2. Had gestational diabetes with all 3 of my pregnancies. The third one, 6 years ago, I was using insulin. I have a normal body mass index, and I generally follow a low-carb diet. I have noticed in the last few months that my blood sugar was higher than normal and that the pancreas was not responding as it used to. I noticed that only because I self-funded the Freestyle Libre and have been putting on a patch from time to time. When I put on, when I noticed this changed, I looked into, I did some research on the internet because I wasn't convinced that I was a type 2, and figured out that there were some specific antibodies that could be tested for. So I asked my family doctor to test for those antibodies, and the anti-GAD and the zinc transporter antibodies came back positive, upon which I informed my endocrinologist of this, who was very surprised that I knew what to ask for in terms of testing, and he immediately put me on insulin and told me to stop metformin, which I was taking 2 or 3 times a day.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for sending in their clips and for sharing their story. Without you guys, it wouldn't be possible to make this awareness video, so thank you so much.